All right, 1 minute to go. We are starting to get some answers for the poll question. So looks like there's 40% of people curious to learn more about product operations, 20% of people trying to transition into product operations, and 40% in the role and looking to scale. No product operations in the audience here, except for Chris and Becky, I suppose. So we'll try to really focus the conversation on those kind of early parts of the journey. What is it? How is it different from other roles and functions within the organization? How do you get started as a team of one? And then how do you scale that role? Awesome. So with that, let's kick it off. We've got a quick session today. One quick update, Hugo unfortunately isn't able to join us because he got COVID. So pretty amazing he lasted this long, but really too bad that we are not able to have him here. He already did say that he's happy to do another follow-up Q&A if there's additional questions that come through. But really excited to welcome Chris and Becky. This is a second session from a kind of product operations overview that we had last month, where we were just overwhelmed with questions. There were so many coming through that we wanted to dedicate some time specifically for audience questions. So I have a list of questions that we didn't get to answer in the last session, and then we'll be answering questions that come in through the chat. So feel free to submit anything throughout. I'll make sure they're covered. And with that, let's jump right in. So Chris, Becky, can you just give us a quick introduction, a little bit about your journey and how you got into product operations? Chris, I'll kick it off to you first.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I've been doing things like product operations for a lot of different like kind of senior leadership roles within product management. I think that a lot of people end up starting that way. They have to figure out how to make their team more effective. And so they need to do this glue work essentially that pulls a bunch of people together. And so that was kind of where I think I started seeing some of the techniques and processes, like was back, I think all the way back when I was at Philosophy, which was a design consultancy, and just trying to figure out how a small team of about 5 product managers could work well together. And then I didn't really have my first official title as a product ops person until I started at Cognizant back in March of 2021. And so that was the first time that essentially I had a product operations title. But yeah, I think the journey for a lot of people is probably just noticing that their teams are not working as well as they could be, and trying to figure out how do we help that. And so I think once I took this role at Cognizant, my incentives were now aligned very much with the fact that this team was going to be a great community. And so anyways, I think that's basically my journey into product operations as a term. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting, Chris, that, a lot of times the term of product operations seems to be new to many people, but the role itself has been around at the same day, right? So they say there's no product ops if there's no product management, you don't have product ops, right? So it's basically the whole process and the people and the skills of running the product organization. And for me, what's interesting, if you think about, when I look back, I realize, I was actually one of the first product operations at PayPal almost 20 years ago. It's insane. When we were brought in, they don't know what to call us. They call us product project manager, product program manager, product portfolio manager, the names going around. But really, to your point, where product operations was brought in because the product manager's role was, just become much, much bigger. So when I was brought into PayPal, we were just expanding internationally. When I started, it was only in 4 countries. And, I was part of the international expansion. And when I started, there was like a binder on my desk, say, new country launch playbook. And that's what our first product operations person wrote that book, and then we started to build on top of it. That's sort of like the glimpse of how we build product operations, really to help the product team, not just working with engineering. We also have to work with the country, with the legal, with the accounting, all the processes to make sure we actually can launch a product like PayPal to the other countries. So interestingly, quote unquote newer or modern product operations that came from companies like Airbnb and Uber, they all started with the country launches because they're a lot more complicated and it's beyond just a product, but it's definitely part of the product. So yeah, so the journey really started then, fast forward many companies later and realized there is a need for product operations, for product organization of all sizes, especially when you start to hit 5, 6, 8 product managers, then sort of like your little team needs a way to operate. So, and lots of challenges as well. We can talk more about why Dragonboat started and really is address multifaceted, complex need of running a product organization and tooling and process along with it.
And one question I've seen in a lot of different forms throughout a lot of the content we've had is, can I get into product operations from X role? So I've seen from project manager, from program manager, from operations, from product manager. So I'm going to kind of group all of those together and shape the question like this. Is there an ideal path? Or is it just kind of a mindset of what that product operations person should do and think about? And that path can be nonlinear from a variety of different previous roles.
Right. Do you want to kick off that, Tris?
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of either you've been a product manager before or you haven't, I think is a good distinction to make. I would say that the benefit of being a product manager is you know what a lot of the pain points probably are already, right? And so being able to dive in and try to focus in on solving those things is really valuable. And then I think the second thing is that it also builds a little bit of trust or confidence from the beginning that you will be there to solve the right problems. I think the key thing that ends up really being most important for this role is, I think, identification of who your customer is, right? Like if we take a lot of and I just wrote a piece about this with the Product-Led Alliance, but I think the real customer is a product manager, and as long as you're aligning around that, I think that you end up doing a lot of the right work. And so to me, that's most important. I think the part that I've seen, at least in the kind of myriad of product operations people that are out there, there's not a lot of standardization around the competencies that go into this. But I think that there is kind of this distinction between product operations people that are focused mostly on process orientation, and that's usually around like safety and certainty. And those people tend to come from kind of operations roles, customer support roles, things like that, I've found. And then people that tend to think about things as more like complex systems, they're more like the product managers that have been around for a while, or user researchers or something like that, right? So I think like there's a value to really embracing the uncertainty of how a complex organization works. And that's what you're doing when you're developing a community of practice. And so I think those types of skills either need to be learned or understood at a very early time. And so I think that's like a really important thing to go after, no matter what your background is. I would say this is a problem though for a lot of product managers, right? Like there are people that are essentially project managers doing a product manager's title a lot of the time, right? There are a lot of people that are there to not necessarily look at the uncertainty of the world or how you work in these complex situations. And so even product managers may not necessarily bring the things that are going to be required, like good facilitation skills, user research from the standpoint of complex organizations, organizational change, transformation, and then definitely like stakeholder and the idea of managing up. Like I think a lot of the role ends up being that you're pushing back on managers, trying to turn the screws on product managers in some way, right? Like what you're trying to do is make sure that the product managers themselves are getting their bottlenecks removed or frictions reduced or something like that to get their job done. Your job, I don't think, is there to like make sure that managers are keeping a close eye on product managers.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I always like to look at things. Well, obviously you have to, if you say who's the customer, that would be very interesting discussion. But let's take one step back. There are very, very many similar roles, I would almost imagine, right? If you think about it, even at a smaller level, you're working with the team, engineering team with product manager, there's a role called a Scrum Master. That could be just product manager themselves, could be a tech lead, could be a rotation role. So there's always a question, what is their job? Is their job just to make sure to protect the Scrum team? Is their job just to make sure that the Scrum team actually produce the product makes sense? So the other analogy I will use up is that there's a revenue ops, right? Think about it, product, you think about a product and go-to-market team, basically it's the two essence of the company. You build something, you sell something, right? So rev ops are in the past is a fraction of the role called the sales ops. So you could also ask that, so what is their role? Who is their customer? What is the purpose of that? Is the sales team their customer? Yes, part of it. But there are also other partners and customers of that role, right? Ultimately, sales teams are happy. We're not selling. We're not produce outcome. The company's not going to go anywhere. We're all going to get in trouble. So I think that the ops role always kind of, because the role is so connected to all functions, you have many, many customers. You have many, many stakeholders. And ultimately, we'll decide to say, hey, what is the things that we need to solve immediately now? If the things we want to solve immediate now is the product team, product manager has the process and the tooling and empowerment and the visibility and alignment to make decisions, for sure. But they're also part of how product organization work with the rest of the organization. How product team work with each other. So I think that the need really evolves depending on a company. It's very funny where, going back again, obviously PayPal is one of sort of my career journey, the biggest part versus all the other companies, even though a lot of the companies all went out from a small company to unicorn public company. But at PayPal, we went through a lot of things that sort of like early the first time, where the first sort of the product ops executive, her title is Chief Operations for Product. So she is literally a COO for our product business. So when I think about our product operations, I really tend to think that at some level, you are a COO of the group you're in. So you have to think about all the elements needed, right? From your team to run your business, to your outcome of your organization, product, and others. So I think a product ops, their role is really, really broad. And obviously you don't do all the things all at once when you started. You really just say, what is the things need to be taken care of first, and then you expand your sphere of influence, and ultimately you expand not only just the outcome that an individual product ops person can produce, really the holistic product organization, right? That's really the ultimate goal, is to say, how do we build and enable a most effective, not effective is not efficient. Effective meaning we want to get to the place we need to get to, and then we're going there in a way as fast as possible by outcome and measurement and all that stuff. So long-winded answer, but it's definitely interesting to see companies evolve and needs evolve, and the role evolves as well.
I mean, I agree with you. I think the part that I worry about or I caution against is this idea that there's not going to be some emergent behavior that comes out of your organization, right? Like I think when we talk about what a COO does, I think in my mind, at least when I think about a COO, it's that they have this understanding of every little thing that's going on inside of their operation, and that they're able to control it and change it in some way. When the reality is like, the reason why we want to have teams that are empowered, and right. All these things, like they have a lot of agency around what they're building, is that there's just going to be some things that we don't specify, right? And this is something I keep on trying to beat the drum about when it comes to product operations, is that there are going to be some things where there's not a problem about that, and so you should just let product managers figure out how they actually deal with things together. And I think like communication.
I totally agree with you. Right? You're not the ones giving that people something to follow, but instead you provide you help the team, you orchestrate the team, but not like micromanage. Right. It's not you pulling the strings, right? Even for COOs, there's CEO has to say, here's the direct direction. We need to align our strategy, and then you can go execute, right? It's not possible for CEO really getting to line of every business. That's just not even humanly possible. But I totally agree with you. There is a spectrum of how much you think, how much there's a desire to be consistent, how much a desire to be aligned, versus how much nothing is sort of like 100% perfect, right? So we need to know this is where we're gonna go, right? And that, at least we need to have the North Star. Here's where we want to go. We can't just say let's go. So that's I kind of agree with you. This is really hard for operations roles to say how much consistency and alignment the organization need at this time, and evolves, right? So I think that that's where, going back to your question, Baji, you asked like, what kind of background It's best for our product operations. I would say, people would be having both the big. Primarily, I think if you have a way to understand bigger picture and be able to work with the team, these are some of the more essential skills you need. Now, that could coming from product, could coming from program, could coming from operations, could coming from other roles, just like a COO coming a lot of backgrounds. But ultimately, there's some skills and trade associated with it, which is you have to have a bigger picture understanding. You have to be able to work cross-functionally. You have to be able to influence without manage, right? So these are the trades that comes with a successful product operations, I think.
Yeah, and one thing I would just add to that too is that the concepts around like developing or keeping a community active and alive, I think is a really, really important aspect of this. And that's why I tend to say that I'm a steward of a community rather than that I'm the product ops person for a community, is because I'm there to cultivate this like interactions between other people so that there can be something that is bigger than anything I could plan. I'm there more to set up the right types of amplification to be able to get people to then do things that are better for themselves as well. So I think that's like all this discussion about like how do you build communities, not only there's a lot of discussion about this today, but I think like looking at the way that those people think about building communities with external users, I think can be applied an awful lot. And there's a lot of people that have thought about this idea of community of practice as kind of a terminology. And so I think those are both things that we can learn from as a product ops person. And you'll either learn it on the job, or if you bring it to the job, you'll be more successful, I think.
Right. Yeah, I think that, it seems to me, Chris, you have a very strong emphasis on sort of the community, like the leader of the product management community in your company. I think it's probably, especially in your current role, you shared earlier, you have, I don't know, hundreds of PMs where it's only you as the product ops. Therefore, your charter is a little bit different, right? In some of the smaller companies, let's say I have 20 PMs have product operations. That is a very, very different focus and need. And in many cases where companies, especially growing very fast, they start to have, from a 1 PM go double and quadruple, and all of a sudden you have a bunch of them, how we should work together, how should we plan, what are our dependencies, where are we going, are we stepping on each other's, we are just a deadlock because we can't move anything because I have my roadmap, you have your roadmap. That's just a very, very different focus. And I think that, understanding where the needs are, to your point, Chris, product manager is a key customer of the product operations. So when you have a large community, mostly self-sufficient, they are independently operating, there's a one mode of operating and a focus. But if you have, say, you have 5, 10, 20 product managers, they are stepping on each other all the time because it's growing so fast, there's no clear understanding who does what. There's, so then you have a slightly different way, not mandate, but you do work with them to say, hey, we have this challenge. How do we solve this challenge, right? So in the past, it will be maybe the VP product has to kind of step in to solve this problem. But then, in many cases, it's the role split, right? You have a product leader with split so that you have a product ops person, be the right-hand person to help scale the organization, make sure the team gets what they need, get the training and tooling and resources and all that stuff, including processes, so that the team can work well and not get burned out, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
That touches on a couple other questions we've seen around how do you get started? And I think both of you alluded to that a little bit. So when you're getting into a product operations role and there's a million things that you could be doing, how do you prioritize and sequence, and how do you get started and make and be successful in your role?
Yeah, I mean, I pull an awful lot from user research as like a really important thing to just understand what you're trying to do, right? And so I think the first thing that I did was try to meet with pretty much every one of the product managers in this very large organization, and then meet with all of the other function leaders that were partners to ours. And then same thing in our case, because we do consulting, trying to meet with all the different like vertical leaders that deal with like healthcare or finance or something like that to understand really what are the problems that are happening, not only from our own self-perception of the community, right? Like what are the problems we deal with as trying to do product management? And some of those that are cognizant are things like, we're not actually sold as product managers when we go on a client, like we're actually like user story writers or scrum masters or something like that, which is much more focused on, the project managing side of the world. But then looking at the other side, it's like, talking to salespeople, talking to function leaders, they don't understand actually what product management does, because product management is a fairly new practice within Cognizant. And so seeing that as understanding how all these different things link together started to create kind of this, I guess like a cyclical flow type of diagram or a causal diagram that says, here's the problems that lead to other problems, right? So we look at it from the standpoint of a complex system, and then we say, where can we start to experiment with interventions? And this comes from like using things like complexity theory from Dave Snowden and Cynefin, starts to get into this world of like, how do I now like make little tweaks here? And did that tweak have the effect I wanted? Did it amplify the behavior I wanted, or did it cause something else that I didn't want? And so I think a very strong amount of like user research to understand and your community. I think it also builds trust with your community, by the way. Like the more costly signals that you give while talking with your community, the better, because they know that you're there for them. The next thing is like, how do you then form hypotheses that are usually focusing on complex systems? And then how do you experiment and start to understand when you should amp up or stop an experiment? And so I think these are all things that like great product managers do anyways, right? It's just that it's like very specifically about our community. And so that's what I did when I first got started. It was like my 30, 60, 90 days, trying to make, basically understand 30 days, start some like hypotheses within 60 days and some early experiments, and then 90 days trying to like have something that turned from an experiment to a success. And so that's kind of the way I would look at 30, 60, 90.
Right. It's good. Really good approach. I want to add on to that a couple. So if you think about it, the way we think about product operations, really think about you are a product manager, right? Your product manager for, you can call it a process, or cadence is how team work, right? So let's just using process. It sounds like a bad word, it's not, right? Every computer runs on processes. So we have a processor. So let's just be that. So product manager, a product operations, it really is a product manager for processes, which means how your product team operate internally with each other and cross-functionally and with executive and stakeholders. Now, if you think about that, you build a roadmap based on outcomes. So you have like the Chris mentioned, right? So what kind of outcomes and problems you try to solve, use that, you build your own roadmap, and then doing user research, which is similar, right? So it's really a product management mindset. But I also want to highlight is there are two likelihood of product operations that are introduced. One is a house on fire. We have so many problems. You throw and say, hey, we need someone to solve the problem. So you know the problem. You go put something on it and kind of stop the bleeding, stop the fire, and then you figure out the broader thing. Sometimes it's a preemptive. People know, okay, I've been in this role before. We know we're going to scale. We know we're going to have this role come in because I know if I have this role, it's going to be amazing. So then you come in. You need to do a lot more to say, what is the first problem we try to solve? You create a roadmap and give you there. So, but I totally agree with you, Chris, in that way, is that, product operations is a product manager. Your product is how you design how the team work together, really being community, being process, being, prioritization, whatever, roadmapping, it is you, but you're not the decision, right? So you have to work with a lot of stakeholders to say, what is the outcome we want to solve now? What is the outcome we want to solve next month, or so on? So I think that's what it is. And if you're throwing a house on fire, go stop the fire and do something else. If you come in that say, we foresee this is coming, then don't bring something, say, I used this before, I'm gonna just job here. It won't work. No matter how experienced, like exactly, it's just not. So you bring what you learned, bring the what's behind the learning, and then learn a new organization again and see how much is really applicable and how much you do need to adjust it. And then ultimately you need to bring the people along, right?
Yeah, and I was just in, like, it's
right.
I was just in a session earlier today with a bunch of people that are like safety professionals, like people that work on oil rigs and OSHA inspections and stuff like that. And we were talking about rituals that are used in those cases, right? And a ritual that I remember from a bunch of different times, like at Microsoft or Facebook, like, is this idea of signing off on a spec. And so back, 20 years ago, we would actually print out the spec and have everybody sign it. But now we have someone like type their name in a box. And we were just talking about this idea of like rituals from the standpoint of like why we do these things and what does make a good ritual. And so I've been thinking an awful lot too just recently about what are the unsaid rituals that we end up doing, right? Like, yeah, sure, there's like agile ceremonies, right? Like that we end up usually including in the way that we do our work, like planning, review, and retro. But I think maybe making these things more apparent or written down for when new people come into an organization, they need to adopt to the culture that's there.
Right.
And so part of product operations is not only to like understand what are these rituals that are happening and to modify them in some way, right? If it's beneficial.
Right.
But also then be kind of the welcoming party for new product managers that are coming into the org, so that, yeah, so basically like people can be way more effective, way faster, right? And so I don't know, I really love this idea of rituals as well. I almost want to call like processes rituals going forward, just because it kind of includes the kind of like weirdness and uncertainty of it as well, rather than just this idea of a set of steps or a checklist, right?
Yeah, I think that's the thing where actually, I think it's a long time. I think at least 5 years ago, not 10 years ago, I wrote something called "Process is the Product." And the product is solving a problem, right? And the product has users. And then more importantly, the product needs to evolve. A lot of times people create a process, they just create it and they forget it, right? So we call this a process debt. It's like a tech debt. When you have people just add on to the process, never say, okay, these things do not apply anymore. Let's just get rid of it, right? So that's a good part of operations. They maintain their process product. Make sure it still makes sense. Make sure the environment is still there and get rid of process debt. And so that actually makes sense. If you don't, it's bloated, right?
Absolutely.
So I think that's really something where, we practice a lot, throughout my journey in product operations, or later on portfolio management, strategic ops. In general, it's like we always just say, okay, we're gonna operate this way now because we learned this. Let's adjust our process, get rid of things no longer apply. Or you can have like 2 use cases. In this use case, you have the heavy-handed. In this use case, you have a lightweight, so that not everyone are subject to the heavy-hand, because there are, like if I launch a country, they will have offices and all that stuff. You're gonna have a lot of people, you're gonna have this book. But if you like a light launch with some translations and local stuff, it's like a 1 page, 16 checklist. You don't need to subject. You have to say which type, so that this sort of like a process as a product, or ritual, right? So you understand why it is there, what problems it's solving, and it continues to improve it and get rid of the process then.
We're getting a lot of good chatter in the chat around how people love process. So
I wrote a piece about like what I calling product operations, creative destruction, right? And I love that term because there's a lot of times where we have to evolve or break down something before we can just like bring it forward. And so, yeah, I definitely think I agree with you. I think there needs to be this ability to break down as well as build up. And those are both sides of the coin of like understanding what is most effective, right?
Right. And that's the same thing as our product, right? So if we build a product over time, it tend to be bloated. You have a feature, the feature never used. So we like the feature adoption. What's the process? Is it apply? How many use cases apply? Can we get rid of it? So if you really take a product mindset, it really solves a lot of the challenges we face today. And that, ultimately, it is, right? Product managers are one of our key customer groups. And the process is just a way to say how we work together. It's to commonly, mutually agree, say this is the best way in most cases. As time goes on, you need someone own it to say, does this still apply? Should we change it? So when you don't have product operation, this is why product operation became a more popular role, is because when you have a more product manager, they exist in an organization for a long enough time and everyone would have to interact with each other, there's no agreed upon way of operating. So someone has to do that. If it's not someone else does it in a part-time role, then it's just not gonna get enough attention. So the organizational cost is tremendous, right? We tend to forget. People say, I got burned out. And actually half the people get burned out from work is because of bad process. Not because of workload. The bad process, the bad tooling, like a double or quadruple sometimes the effort you need to do your real job. Therefore, people get burned out and they couldn't figure out why they're burned out. The reality is that we actually tested out, right? So literally people get burned out because they have bad process, bad toolings, people haven't spent so much time on considered as non-essential work. but it's needed for them to do their work, right? So it's a tremendous.
Yeah, I mean, this is,
right.
I think the calendar audit, like having one of the first things I've been starting to think about is like time management is a huge issue for a lot of product managers because they'll be in meetings from like 9 to 5, and then it's, oh, when do I do the deep work that I need to do? And so to your point, right, like doing a calendar audit of your community, I think is something that can be really, really effective, and understanding when you've had to change the way that you make decisions in some significant way due to process. I think you can start to get into this world of like actually understand the true cost of certain processes that are, and then you need to make that trade-off, right? Is it worth being safe in this way for us to have this cost? And if not, then how do we change that?
Or how do you do it?
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
You know, so I think, just going back why I started Dragonboat, right? Because I spend my Sunday afternoon to write updates to my 6 different sets of the stakeholders when I see different data. And I spend half my week to do planning and negotiation and all that stuff and whatever. So ultimately, when you have a tool to automate stuff, then at least you can get rid of stuff and also give you visibility on the problem, just like calendar audit. What if you don't have a calendar? You can't even do an audit, right? But when you have something like a calendar, you say, okay, these are the ineffective things. These are the things we could do it differently. Or maybe we should have group session. Maybe we should use tool. There are a lot of things today we all face the biggest challenge is how do we collaborate? Collaboration is the biggest challenge in modern world, I believe, because, previously the manufacturing world, there's no coordination, right? Just workflow. And today is everyone's dependent on each other. So the collaboration at the different places, from the Scrum teams, cross-functional team, to between PMs and PMs with various levels of organization. So all that is taking a lot, think about the number of notes you have to go through, right? So,
I mean, that's why, I think the concept of Taylorism is applied to product roles, for example, is bad in some way, because there's no one right way to do something, or there's not a best way to do something, right? There's a lot of ways to do things, and there's ways that will work here based on organizational context, and there are things that will work for our customers, but there's not a one way that you can sign. I don't even think you can have lots of great data. You may not be able to scientifically prove that this process is better over another, because you have things like opportunity costs. You have these things where you make a decision, you can't go back and remake the decision probably because the context is now changed in some way. So I think there's a lot of enabling the art of product management is something that product operations people should be doing as well.
Right. I agree with you. Ultimately, it's almost like a solving. So the challenge we're facing for most of product operations, or actually for product organization, is that you have categories of challenges, right? So one category of the challenge is how product managers get the resources and the tooling and visibility, alignment, data, all that stuff to do their job well, right? The other part is what is the way that the product management can work well with each others and also up and down the chain, right? So when product teams and leadership team, for whatever reason, there's always transition from a strategy goals to initiative to work. That whole transition is a very big part of a complex coordination, and it's changing. So that's a good thing, right? If it's not changing, that's not a good thing, right? So how do you maintain and manage and enable that part of the collaboration, right? So then the third part is the collaboration, not only within product managers themselves, also with the cross-functional teams. Today, we all talk about product-led. If you think about product-led or product-focused company, that means it takes more than just product management. Obviously, product engineering work very closely, product marketing, product and product and sales, so product and customer success. All these, how do you interact so that, like you said, product managers spend all day having meetings, because all the collaboration they have to do with themselves and they go up and down the chain and with all the cross-functional teams. So bring them together to make that easier, streamlined, and that's a big part of enable product managers to do their job, right? The product managers love to solve problems, love to, customers and the market, and not so much of the things moving around.
Yeah, maybe the right way to think about this is that we're trying to help make the product manager's job legible enough to other groups. right? Not too legible. Like a lot of what we do is kind of open-ended in some way and negotiated.
Right.
But making things like a little bit more legible, like the idea of portfolio planning or road mapping or these types of things that start to like, how do we make this more understood as far as like the way we will do our work when needed? And then when are we going to go off and like figure out things?
Right. So that's sort of exactly. So, because ultimately everyone depends on product, right? Yeah. Customer success teams depend on product marketing and everyone sells, right? So therefore it's essential to provide like, you can call it visibility or legible and whatever, right? So people needs to know why you use this and where you are and how we progress. So these are the things, can be time consuming. That's, we can definitely help to address some of those challenges.
Well, thank you so much, Chris and Becky. This was an amazing session. We do have to switch gears now, but the conversation is not over. We are in the chat all day. And of course, please connect with us. Our contact info is at the bottom of the booth, and connect with Chris on Twitter. And we will get back to anyone's questions that we did not answer. So with that, I'd like to say thank you so much, Chris. And we're going to welcome up on stage Melissa.